Welcome to another episode of the Reedman Report, where we talk about risk, security, and education. All three of those issues came together last week because on March 12th, it was the first time since 9/11 when there were two terrorist attacks in the United States that happened on the same day. At Old Dominion University, a man who had previously been convicted of providing support to the Islamic State walked into an ROTC class, opened fire, killing the instructor and wounding two students before he was killed. And at exactly the same time, at Temple Israel in Michigan, a man drove a vehicle loaded with explosives and flammable liquids into the temple. That temple is also a K through 12 school and daycare center. He opened fire at a security guard and then killed himself. And fortunately, his crudely made car bomb did not go off, or else it would have been a pretty substantial explosion and damage there to the building. So since there were not only two terrorist attacks in the United States on the same day, but both of those targeting education, both pre-K to K-12 and higher education, I think it's important to have probably the world's leading expert in terrorism join me today to talk about this. So Professor Bruce Hoffman is a professor at Georgetown University. Going back to 9/11, he was appointed by Congress to serve as the commissioner of the independent review of the FBI's post 9/11 response to terrorism. He was the author of the final report. He was a scholar in residence at the Central Intelligence Agency. He was an advisor on counterterrorism to the National Security Affairs headquarters in Baghdad. And he also was the founding director for the Center for Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at St. Andrews University in Scotland, which is the spy university, thus why Mr. Bruce Hoffman is an expert in terrorism and did all of that work for the intelligence community. Professor Hoffman, thanks for coming to the show today.
No, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
So the U.S. is at war, which is a different circumstance than we have been in quite a while. And that war is with Iran, which is a country that, they've chanted death to America in the streets for the last few decades. But coming out of World War II, Iran was one of the kind of more progressive, more educated, resource-rich countries in the Middle East. What fractured the U.S. and Iranian relationship for all of these years?
Firstly, it was the revolution itself that deposed the Shah of Iran, who was a close U.S. ally, a monarch, and replaced him with the Ayatollah Khomeini, who installed in Iran a clerical theocracy that governed and ruled the country. Even then, I don't think it was necessarily preordained that U.S.-Iranian relations would go into the dumpster that they've been in for decades. But two incidents in particular precipitated that worsening of relations that never recovered. I mean, the first was that in an act of compassion, then President Jimmy Carter admitted the Shah of Iran to the United States after he departed from Iran because he was dying of cancer, so he could get medical treatment. And this immediately incurred the wrath of the new Iranian Islamic Republic. And then, of course, just a few months later, in November 1979, the revolution had been in January, November 1979, you have the seizure of 52 American diplomats at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and they're being held hostage for 444 days. So those two incidents, especially the violation of the diplomatic sanctity of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, but then the holding of our diplomats, and of course under the Geneva Treaties and various codicils of international law, diplomats are protected persons. They're not supposed to be seized as hostages or attacked. So that certainly soured relations. And then from the time of the revolution, Iran embraced terrorism as an instrument of its foreign policy. And we saw manifestations of that a year after the revolution, about 18 months after the revolution, when the Shah's former press spokesman, Ali Tabatabai, was gunned down by an assassin in the pay of the Iranian government at his suburban Washington, D.C. home. Then, of course, in 1983, you have the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut by Hezbollah, a terrorist entity, not using that name at the time. It called itself then the Islamic Jihad Organization, but created, funded, trained, guided, ordered by Iran. Then the terrible tragedy the following October at the U.S. Marine Barracks at Beirut International Airport in 1984, the bombing of the new U.S. Embassy in Beirut. The following year, the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait, on through 1996, when you had the bombing of the U.S. Air Force barracks in Khobar, Saudi Arabia. So there's a long history of enmity directed at the United States by Iran, and tangible manifestations of Iran's embrace of terrorism as an instrument of its foreign policy.
So we're in a kinetic war with Iran right now, and the first parts of that war were sinking the Iranian Navy, destroying the Air Force, destroying various military targets. But Iran has historically not used its kind of traditional military hardware. It's been money that's transferred to a variety of different terrorist organizations. Why was the Iranian government kind of aligned with the objectives of terrorist organizations, and what made that a viable strategy for them rather than kind of hard military power?
I'm old enough to remember very distinctly the January 1979 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, which had an article, obviously ghost written for the Shah, but had the Shah of Iran's name on it, which was about how Iran saw itself as a guarantor of stability and security in the Middle East and in the Persian or Arabian Gulf in particular. And it's always had this aspiration. I mean, throughout history, the contest between Persians and Arabs has regularly reshaped the history and culture of the Middle East. But that was the pre-revolutionary government. The revolutionary government never was able to acquire the military purchase credits or the assistance of foreign countries in rebuilding its military in a way the Shah had been attempting to, but it never completely succeeded. So Iran was never a military power, but after the revolution, a lot of senior military officers were either tried and executed or fled the country. So there was an immense brain drain. Many of them flew some of the planes away. So Iran has never been a conventional power, and even when it at least attempted to function as one from 1980 to 1989 in the terrible war against Iraq, where over 1 million people were killed. Whatever aspirations it had of being a conventional military power basically ended in the 1980s because of this long and debilitating war they fought with Iraq. So consequently, Iran embarked on two parallel tracks. Firstly, developing an unconventional weapons capability with its nuclear arsenal, which fortunately has never completely succeeded in doing, and developing another unconventional capability, but at the low end of the technological spectrum, which was creating a network of proxy groups throughout the Middle East, groups that were Shia, a minority of most Muslim people, but is the majority form of Islam in Iran, but also forging very close ties with Sunni terrorist groups like Hamas in Palestine and Islamic Jihad, and with Shia offshoot groups like the Houthis. So in other words, while Iran was intent on building up its nuclear capability, in the meanwhile, it was engaged in surrogate or proxy warfare, attempting to destabilize the Middle East, knock all of its actual and potential opponents off balance, and then using terrorism to keep them off balance, and therefore not pose a significant threat to Iran.
To come back to a point you made there a moment ago about Iran is a majority Persian population and it's a majority Shia population, whereas most of the other countries in the Middle East have a mixture of two different populations. Especially that was clear in Iraq, a country you know very well, where there was pretty much the immediate fracture after the U.S. pulled out, where the Islamic State was able to, within a couple of weeks, take half of the country because it just divided along,
Right.
the Sunni Shia line. Why is Iran different, having that majority Persian, majority Shia, kind of unified ethnic and religious affiliation in the country?
Well, they're not Arabs, exactly as you've said. I mean, that's significant, but that hasn't stopped them from forging very close and deep ties with extremist movements in a variety of Arab countries, whether it's Iraq, Yemen, Gaza Strip, the West Bank, certainly Syria as well, and Lebanon, of course. And I think because the Iranians are the ultimate practical nation in a sense that they not only live by the mantra but fervently embrace the mantra that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Which is something that the U.S. foreign policy may have lost in the last few years, but that's a different topic than we have today. Uh, Back to the terrorist groups and deciding to fund terrorism. I think there's a common misconception I hear a lot, that terrorism is about fear. I think people hear terror and they think terror fear. But terrorism is the use of violence or threats of violence, usually targeting civilians because they're the obvious target, but it also targets military bases, ships, embassies, government buildings. And it is not about instilling fear. It's about achieving some sort of political, ideological, or religious goal. So you're trying to change the structure of a society or a government through that violence. What are the goals that Iran is trying to project into the other regions where they're sponsoring terrorist groups?
Well, it's really akin to the Comintern in the 1920s and after the Bolshevik Revolution that brought the communists to power in Russia that became the Soviet Union. It was the export of the revolution to create a buffer zone, in essence, so that the Soviet Union wouldn't be vulnerable to counter revolutionaries or to any reversal of the revolution. I think that was the initial driving force behind Iran. In other words, distract attention away from Iran, for instance, to Lebanon. Turn Lebanon, which had been certainly as a sectarian, a multi-confessional country with large Christian, Sunni, Druze, as well as Shia population, turn that into a cauldron of violence and therefore deflect and detract attention from Iran. Create, on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, a conflict that would draw the attention of the West, and I think in the Iranian calculus, um, preoccupy the West so much that Iran could basically do whatever it wanted, and the theocracy there could survive.
With that, so there's a kind of a wide array of Islamic terrorist groups in terms of financing, coordination, level of cohesion, ideology. But what we tend to see in the United States when a terrorist attack occurs, aside from 9/11, which was an orchestrated, funded plot, directed by Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, most of the terrorist plots, things like the Boston Marathon bombing, were people that attached themselves to the kind of identity and goals of the group, but they were never formally trained. They were never formally financed. They're kind of the lone wolf radicalized terrorists. That kind of appears to be the situations that happened last week with the attack on the temple in Michigan. Was because it was reported that that man had four relatives that were killed in the airstrikes in Lebanon. And so that attack against this temple was his retribution for that. The Old Dominion attack was a guy who previously provided support to ISIS, and attacking the U.S. military in a place close to him was his way to do that. How do you see the war with Iran now kind of escalating or changing the domestic threat environment here in the United States?
Well, I mean, as you've described, I mean, empirically, we've had incidents inspired, motivated by Iran occur in Austin, Texas, where someone went in and shot up a bar and killed two people. And then, of course, now this incident in West Bloomfield, Michigan. So we've already seen it. I suspect that the longer the war drags on, the more of these incidents we will see as people become more aggrieved over the loss of life in the Middle East, but also as Iran becomes more desperate and therefore encourages this and may even activate if there are sleeper cells. I have no idea whether there are or aren't in the United States. The pattern of Iranian sponsored terrorism over the past decade plus has been more to pay for hire, to hire mobsters or criminals or narcotics traffickers or ordinary thugs to carry out attacks on behalf of Iran than to actually use any of its assets. But we're just talking about physical threats. There's a whole range of cyber threats that can be unleashed as well. I would say Iran is only surpassed by Russia and China in its capabilities of engaging in cyber attacks. We know Iran has penetrated certainly our infrastructure. So Iran has regularly engaged in a variety of hostile cyber attacks over the years. So we should anticipate those types of attacks as well in the digital realm, the longer the war goes on.
You mentioned, if there are sleeper cells in the United States, how first, what is a sleeper cell, and then how have attacks of that type played out in different places around the world, and how would Iran have kind of played the long game of setting up that type of capability?
Well, a sleeper cell is basically operatives that are prepositioned in a foreign country and are told to live a cover life, to live normal lives, but who are standing by for activation and then have been previously trained in carrying out whether it's sabotage or actual terrorist attacks. And in the past, Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese Shia terrorist organization that's closely aligned with Iran, have been arrested in the United States. I mean, engaging often in criminal activities, monkeying around with the weights and measures at gas stations in Michigan, for example, or trafficking in untaxed cigarettes in North Carolina. And especially in Latin America, in Argentina, we saw how on two occasions, Hezbollah operatives, it's unclear how long they'd been in the country, working in league with Iranian diplomats, carried out the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, where more Argentines were killed than Israeli diplomats. And then 2 years later, the attack on a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, where over 80 people were killed and more than 300 others injured. These were clear cases of using terrorist operatives, receiving their orders and perhaps even other instructions and weaponry from the embassy. But then, for instance, in 2011, when relations between the United States and Iran were, at the risk of understatement, more positive than they are today, if not exactly harmonious, this was the end of the first term of the Obama administration. The administration had made no secret that one of the cornerstones, if it were reelected, of its foreign policy would be a nuclear deal with Iran. And yet, in October 2011, it came to light that Iran had paid someone in Texas who claimed to have connections with Los Zetas, a Mexican narcotics cartel, to carry out the bombing of a very upscale Washington, D.C. restaurant in Georgetown to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador. So that was a very sensitive and high visibility operation had it succeeded, but they didn't use a professional terrorist operative belonging to Hezbollah or any other terrorist group. They used it, the uncle of Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps commander who claimed to have connections with Los Zetas. They were paying him off to do it. And that may have been indicative of how a network of sleeper cells they once built up may potentially have degraded or eroded. There have been several incidents in New York where a prominent Iranian dissident in exile, Maseh Alinejad, was the subject of a kidnapping attempt, a botched kidnapping attempt, and a botched assassination attempt. In both instances, criminal gangs were involved, not professional terrorists. So we might infer that this is the way Iran prefers to go, and certainly in Scandinavia and other countries, there have been reports of even biker gangs in Canada. Canadian Hells Angels was enlisted to carry out an Iranian hit. That may be their modus operandi going forward, given that they may not have this capability of activating sleepers. We just don't know.
So if there were an attack that occurs in the United States, either through kind of a pre-placed and activated sleeper cell, some other criminal organization that's hired, or just a homegrown radicalized person who doesn't have any contact with them, but believes in the cause, and there's an attack that kills dozens or hundreds of Americans, how would that be a strategic success for Iran?
Well, whether it would be a strategic success or not, I think is debatable. What they would be hoping to do is raise the cost of the war to such an extent that the United States might sue for peace or might declare victory and say the war is over. That would be their gamble, but terrorists and even the Iranian government, may not read their audience correctly. I think a major terrorist attack in the United States would only ratchet up the war, not derail it. But again, they may have a different estimation, could make a fatal blunder.
Well, I think that's where we're in a really complicated situation right now. Is we've got 5 players in this war that all have a very different kind of motivation and end state that they're looking for. Iran has the goal, of creating a nuclear weapon, either for offensive or for deterrent capability, and they want to, kind of exert maximum influence in that region. They don't want to just. It's not in the Iranian interest to just be a peace broker and disarmed nation there. Israel has the motivation for Iran to be completely disarmed and no longer an existential threat to the country. Both China and Russia are providing, weapons and intelligence support and funding and resources to Iran. Russia wants this to continue as long as possible, wants the Strait of Hormuz to stay closed, because not only have their oil sanctions been lifted, but now, their oil is worth more than it ever has been, and they desperately need money after sanctions had really caused their last offensive in Ukraine to stall. And the U.S., it's not really clear what our objective is with this, other than our objective now is that we need to get the strait reopened, get global trade flowing again, and somehow extricate ourselves from this without taking significant losses. But this president probably does not want to admit any sort of retreat or failure. So when you've got 5 parties that all have conflicting goals here, if you were advising the president or the National Security Council right now, what would your advice be to a viable kind of end state of this conflict?
Well, I mean, like any conflict, you have to, as Clausewitz, the famous military strategist, said, that war is a continuation of politics by other means, but you have to have a clear objective. And that's what has remained elusive. We heard a number of different clear objectives. I think the most important one is the complete elimination of Iran's nuclear capability. That has to be the preeminent objective. But President Trump, after all, in January, did tell the Iranian people, wait, help is coming, that we're going to basically engineer regime change. I don't know how achievable that is now. And of course, there's a danger of the regime just becoming more ossified or not. But that to me would be the second priority. And the third one has to be, or maybe equal to the second, has to be ensuring the navigation of the Straits of Hormuz indefinitely so that they can never be closed. So let's say that's the second one, um, on par with, I think, fulfilling the commitment we made to the Iranian people that there needs to be regime change. Because only when there's regime change can we be confident that Iran, look, is one of four state sponsors designated by the U.S. Department of State, but it's by far the most active of the four. That has to change. And any failure to effect that change because of this war will be very hard to put a very positive spin on the war's outcome. So it's just like you described the five actors and the complexity there, that even the complexity of one's advice is, yeah, the nuclear is preeminent, but these other considerations have to be equal, almost as important.
So you were, advising the CIA and national security officials on the situation in Iraq in 2004, 5, and 6, kind of at the heat of the war there, and a lot of the efforts to have regime change and put another government in place. Well, they were somewhat stable. While the U.S. had a large presence there, it very quickly collapsed, and ISIS was able to take control of a huge part of that region. Um, what do you think it would take to have an effective and an effective regime change that has long-term stability in Iran? And are we able to be the broker of that, or is there someone else in the region that ultimately would need to kind of be at the center of that nation building?
Well, it's really hard to see who else in the region could be at the center of it because almost all the other states see Iran as an enemy. And even if they didn't, Iran's expansion of this war into their territory, whether it's Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, now certainly see Iran as an enemy. Um, so I don't, sure, I mean, Russia may be the only conceivable interlocutor, and part of, let's say, the best outcome we could think of would be that Khamenei, the new supreme leader, and the clique somehow is induced to join the former president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, in exile in Moscow. I'm not sure that that will necessarily happen, but that would have to, that would be the ideal outcome. And what's different with Iraq is that, I mean, Iraq never had a democratic election until 2005. It had been a monarchy and then it had been a dictatorship for decades. That's not to say that democracy has necessarily been allowed to flower in Iran in the past. And of course, the 1953 coup, engineered by the British and the United States, that overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh is a source of considerable suspicion and enmity towards the United States now for half a century. But at the same time, though, Iran, what Iran had a monarchy, and Reza Pahlavi, at least, is extremely popular with diaspora Iranians. I mean, when President Bush doubted his popularity last month or the end of January, Reza Pahlavi said, "I'll show you," and actually called for demonstrations in his favor. And we saw hundreds of thousands of people in Europe, in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, and even in Iran, waving his photograph and pledging their support. So there may be a potential there that never existed in Iraq that could be the basis of a constitutional monarchy in Iran that could lead to the transition to a democracy, but might provide the glue of stability. But none of that's going to happen until the hardliners that have not only ruled Iran since 1979, but also have turned it into a lucrative business. I mean, the IRGC has its hands in any number of very profitable commercial enterprises in that country. wresting them from control of Iran is going to be extremely different. And that's a big, I mean, you could argue that Iraq was led by Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist Party, and that once you decapitated the Ba'athist regime and then cashiered everyone, the Ba'athist Party's power ended. That's a lot more difficult to achieve in Iran, given how entrenched the IRGC now is.
And if really the only successful outcome for the United States is a regime change, the only successful outcome for Israel is a regime change that permanently removes Iran as being, an existential threat to the country. All the signs right now are pointing towards this transitioning from airstrikes into a ground war. Marine Expeditionary Unit was moved from the Indo-Pacific this week towards the Persian Gulf. The 82nd Airborne had a large training exercise that was canceled, and it seems likely that they'll be moved into that area. From what you saw in Iraq, with the size of the ground force that was needed, the amount of kind of ongoing work by the ground forces, the landmass of Iran is about 3 times larger. The entire southern region along the strait is extremely mountainous. There are 90 million people in Iran. I've seen estimates anywhere from 800,000 to 2 million ground troops are what the United States would need in the country there to kind of have an effective fighting force. From the things that you saw that went right and wrong in Iraq, what would your advice be on how to proceed forward with a ground offensive in Iran?
Well, I don't think there'll be a ground offensive. Whatever troops are being positioned may be deployed with very specific and limited objectives. Seizing Karg Island, for instance, Iran's main oil producing facilities are located there. I could see that kind of operation. Seizing the estimated 400 pounds of enriched uranium that it has could be another one, which would require sizable military forces and equipment because it's buried underground. But it wouldn't be an invasion. I think it would be a much more limited military incursion, which carries with it tremendous risks. But, as the old adage goes, wars are easy to start and difficult to control. So, and I would also say, 3 weeks in, we're still in very early days. Everybody goes to war thinking the war is going to be short, and inevitably it never is.
Yeah, I think the point that has been discussed by quite a few of the kind of geopolitical experts is that an air campaign has never led to an effective regime change. So I think that we're in a complicated situation where as I mentioned earlier, we have these 5 different powers involved who all want to see different outcomes from this. But also some of our military strategies and capabilities might not be aligned with our end goals, because if we have an end goal of regime change, we're not going to do that through air power. If our goal was simply to degrade their conventional military capabilities, we can do that with air power. If we want to remove that nuclear material, that's something that may be a very complex operation to not only get the equipment in that can uncover the rubble and get down into these sites and have the special containers, but then you need a land route out of the country with that material. So, I mean, that's a very extensive operation. I think any way we cut it, we're looking at, this is not an operation of days or weeks. It's probably an operation of months, and months can quickly become years. Coming back to the United States, the last question I have for you, because most of the listeners of this podcast are people in local government, in local law enforcement, school officials, parents. If we're in this new kind of heightened domestic kind of terror environment, what should people be thinking about every day? What should people be kind of watching for, doing differently, or what could we expect happening here in the United States?
It's really hard, almost impossible to say. I mean, even without political tensions in the Middle East, we've had a history of mass shootings, as you well know, in schools and elsewhere. Some politically motivated, others, perhaps the majority, completely apolitical. Uh, Tensions, and especially being involved in a war, just superimpose another layer of concern. And I think, as always against terrorism, it's the quote attributed to Thomas Jefferson: "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." Is that we have to remain vigilant. We can't be complacent. We can't think that it can't happen here because we've already seen individuals motivated and inspired by Iran engage in acts of violence. I think we have to recognize that the longer the war goes on, the more the possibility of violence increase. So it really is a matter of vigilance and of our authorities being aware of the potential for threats that deliberately target innocent people and the public at large.
Well, for what has been for most of these episodes, the most depressing podcast on the internet as we talk about school shootings and manifestos and everything else, this is really an equally depressing topic. Uh, is there any positive that has come out of this that you can leave the audience with?
Well, I mean, we see the Lebanese government decisively taking action. Well, I shouldn't say decisively, at least rhetorically taking action against Hezbollah, talking about Hezbollah being outlawed, talking about forcing Hezbollah to surrender its arms. If that's followed by decisive action, that will be in and of itself a significant improvement, and would also offer the people of Lebanon the chance to function in a true democracy rather than having one sectarian group impose its will on the rest of the country. If Iran is deprived of its nuclear capability permanently, that's an enormous accomplishment. So I think it's still early days, but the success of this war will indeed be predicated on our ability in responding to, but even more so, preventing and interdicting any terrorist plots or attacks in this country. And then, God forbid they do happen, effectively responding to them in a way that doesn't invite more attacks, but demonstrates our capabilities and the resiliency of this country.
All right, well, Professor Hoffman, thank you so much for your knowledge on this topic. And hopefully this finds some sort of resolution soon. But if not, I hope you will rejoin me to talk about this again if there are major progressions. All the links to Bruce's most recent book, his other books, Inside Terrorism, which is a textbook for many courses, including the intelligence class that I'm teaching now. Check those out if you haven't read them. And Bruce, thanks again for your time.
You're very welcome, David. Thanks for having me.